Welcome to On Air. I'm Klara Syrewicz, and today we'll show you once again how to steal an election and, coincidentally, how to build shark tanks and transport giant baobabs, all while making the Kremlin happy. Finally, in our report, we'll look at some old-fashioned ways of spying. If you're a Eurocrat, this is probably the tune that plays in your head while you bite your nails, worrying, no, not about swing states in the US election, but the other Georgia on my mind, and the other election, the one that took place last week. Once upon a time, in the Caucasus Mountains was a country named Georgia, a former Soviet state that maintained strong pro-Western aspirations with up to 80% of its residents in favor of joining the European Union. But high above Tbilisi, in a scary-looking castle, lived a short yet very powerful man, the founder of a populist party named Georgian Dream that dragged the country back into Russia's sphere of influence. Parliamentary elections, which gave his party 53% of the vote compared to 38% for the pro-Western opposition, were marred by widespread threats and, in some cases, violence, often performed by state-controlled services. The valiant pro-Western president Salome Zurabishvili, who was unfortunately struck by a spell that made her government role mainly decorous, called for citizens to take to the streets and protest. Meanwhile, the men in the high castle vowed to ban all opposition parties after the elections, labeling them traitors. And that, dear kids, is the scary Halloween story of how the Georgian Dream victory became the EU's Georgian nightmare. Except the EU really saw it coming and did very little to protect its own interests. Nestled between the authoritarian regimes of Russia, Azerbaijan and Turkey, Georgia provides the only alternative route, beside Russia, for Central Asian and Azerbaijani trade with the West. Trade that could flow without Russia's total control and leverage, especially to Western countries seeking to reduce their dependence on Russian energy. Georgia's pro-Western course was always an exception in the region and a true gem from a geopolitical perspective. But despite earlier warnings of the state capture by Russia, the European Commission had only put on hold the country's EU candidate status. Worse even, when news of the dodgy election reached Brussels, no one even cared to visit Georgia. No one, except of course Viktor Orban, whose obsequious acclamation for the government's victory preceded final exit polls. Meanwhile, EU government ministers are planning to discuss all this during the Foreign Affairs Council in mid-November. So I guess we can all go to sleep until then. In the meantime, it would also be fair to mitigate the fairy tale that Brussels likes to tell itself. Despite the protests and the evident vote interference, at least a third of Georgians do seem to support the GD party, some for valid reasons which include national interests and justified fear. Others may still associate the party with EU accession. Confused? Let me explain. Georgian Dream features the EU logo on its election banners and claims it wants to join the bloc, but on its own terms, with dignity. What that means exactly is rather confusing and involves a lot of anti-LGBTQ and traditional values narratives. But beside that, the party has portrayed the EU and its rivals as wanting to drag Georgia into the Ukrainian war, echoing Moscow's propaganda that countries pursuing a pro-EU or pro-NATO agenda are playing with fire. Their campaign message has contrasted bombed-out Ukraine with peaceful images from Georgia. The war left deep scars, and despite Russia remaining unpopular among ordinary Georgians, they see what happened in Ukraine and that the EU is not going to come to anyone's rescue if Russia puts boots on the ground. That was the stick, now time for the carrot. Foreign Minister Lavrov is also dangling the promise of handing back those breakaway regions. I'm sorry to admit, but with 20% of my territory at stake, I would certainly think about it, and what a symbolic victory that would be. For Moscow, it would also be a good deal. Russian troops stationed there could be deployed, well, you know where. Plus, considering Moscow has just released a revised national budget for 2025 and the state of its finances don't look so pretty, it could stop supporting local leaders who are completely dependent on Russia to pay state salaries and pensions, and also put a brake on subsidies for the region's energy prices, making them suddenly and brutally commercial. Earlier this month, Moscow already did that in Abkhazia. Dumping those costs back onto Georgia would be practical, especially considering the entire country may soon be their satellite again. But those are small costs for a man whose net worth equals 1/4 of Georgia's entire GDP and whom, from a political perspective, already owns the country. Meet Bidzina Ivanishvili. Like in neighboring Russia, Georgia has the pretense of a democratic system with divisions of power and elections. But under Ivanishvili, the country's institutions have become centralized in his hands. Ivanishvili made his fortune in Russia in the 1990s, in part thanks to long-standing ties to Moscow's secret services. In the early days of his rise, he crafted the reputation of a magnanimous oligarch, making showy benevolent gestures. He founded the Georgian Dream party in 2012, and when it won the election that same year, he positioned loyalists in all possible corners of the state, while he resigned from the post of prime minister within a few months. But he maintained what became a shadowy informal power. His party has reigned ever since. And because pivoting away from the West and towards Moscow offers aspiring autocrats the chance to cement total control, his party gradually started dropping its pro-European course. All the richer to say that Europe has suddenly woken up to the fact that he's not a good guy. I mean, this man couldn't have tried harder to prove it. Just look at his house. It's a Bond villain lair with what looks like a giant steel ball in a jar to crush voter observers while they scuttle away, and even a shark tank where he might, oh so slowly, lower President Zurabishvili, considering he's been promising Nuremberg-style trials for the opposition, and who knows if he meant death penalties by that. In a country proudly exhibiting risque architecture, complete with a bridge locally known as the sanitary pad and this tampon-shaped building, the official narrative has been nonetheless very conservative, in alliance with the influential Orthodox Church. Ivanishvili has sought to present the West as so degenerate as to claim in a recent TV interview that over here, men's bathrooms are being equipped with hygienic pads and men's milk is equated to female milk. It looks like he has not been in a public lavatory for a long time, I guess. Probably won't be visiting one in Europe, considering he might soon be sanctioned. Farewell to those architectural inspirations. But the one thing I can't get my head around is, what did he mean by men's milk? Anyway, he is full of other delightful surprises. Much like anyone who survived the dog-eat-dog capitalism of 90s Russia with mafia kidnappings and torture, Ivanishvili has retained earnest, childlike fantasies of big private zoos and monstrously large trees. He's been bringing giant baobabs and magnolias by boat along the Black Sea and on the back of Georgian taxpayers' money. And if practicing eco-terrorism in Kenya and Georgia wasn't enough, there's also his albino rapper son Bera, known locally as Jeffrey Baratheon, set with private recording studio, model wife, bodybuilder torso, glitzy videos. You're watching the song Parlez-vous français? And with many dubious claims about his alleged international popularity. And in case you had any hesitancy about his talent, his dad's security apparatus could easily make you think otherwise, like it did to online critics, some of whom were minors. The love is clearly reciprocated. In an interview for Wire magazine, Bera said of his father, "For me, for a son, it's heartbreaking to see that now you have some idiots who can allow themselves to say something about my dad or to critique his moves." And reminiscing of older, better times, he added, "There was this aura where you could not even mention his name out loud. It was sort of how you would speak about our greatest kings, or big mafia bosses, or Voldemort." Nowadays, Bera is allegedly setting up shop in Brazil to move his dad's assets there before the EU maybe just timidly impose some sanctions on him and his cronies. How about not pondering this too long? In any case, even though the fears, interests and aspirations of ordinary Georgians are to be reckoned with, those have been clearly hijacked by a kleptocrat. And meanwhile, the country's westward-looking voters are left on the edge of a shark tank. When I say critical infrastructure, you probably imagine power plants and hospitals, but not the seabed. And yet this is where we get most of our energy and information supply, with oil and gas pipelines or internet and electric cables lining the sea floor. In this report, we'll show you how foreign vessels have been prowling the Baltic and the North Sea, engaging in intense espionage and sabotage activities.
In October last year, the new polar bear and the Russian nuclear-powered cargo ship Sevmorput gained prominence in the news sphere. The vessels were central to an investigation by Finnish authorities into damage inflicted on the Baltic Connector natural gas pipeline and key telecommunication cables in the Gulf of Finland.
Our police and authorities are doing an excellent job to investigating what has happened with Baltic Connector, and it looks like that Chinese ship has been there just the time the pipeline has broke, and that's why we have open diplomatic discussion with Chinese, and also we have started cooperation with Chinese authorities.
The incident, which occurred on October 7, 2023, has raised alarms about the vulnerability of critical infrastructure in the region, as both ships are also suspected of being involved in damaging the EES-1 submarine communications cable connecting Sweden and Estonia. In September, the United States observed heightened Russian military activity near essential undersea cables, with a specialized military unit employing an array of surface vessels, submarines, and naval drones. This suggests Russia might be increasingly inclined to engage in sabotage operations targeting a crucial part of global communications infrastructure.
Russia has been mapping out several of these wind parks, maritime cables, pipelines, location of underseas critical infrastructure in the Baltic Sea and in the Arctic. And we know that Russia has a fleet that is capable of conducting such sabotage operations.
Researchers found that since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, these vessels have made over 400 suspicious voyages within European countries' exclusive economic zones or EEZs. 72 of these vessels, officially designated for research, exhibited suspicious behavior such as traveling extremely slowly, performing erratic zigzag patterns, or halting unexpectedly. These patterns suggest potential reconnaissance of key undersea assets, further escalating concerns about regional security. This whale was discovered by fishermen off the coast of Norway in April 2019. It was wearing a camera harness with the inscription St. Petersburg. When found, it was quickly dubbed a spy whale, alluding to a Russian military base where whales and dolphins are trained for espionage purposes. However, his story ended tragically a month ago, when he died after a stick became lodged in his mouth, leading some to speculate about the possibility of more sinister motives. With Russia's influence extending deep into the waters of the Baltic and North Seas, regional leaders are increasingly focusing on safeguarding critical infrastructure and ensuring that incidents like those involving the Baltic Connector do not escalate further.
Welcome back, and here's today's guest, John Todd.
Hello, Klara.
Hello. After Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, we have New Polar Bear, a very cuddly name for a cable destroyer with quite sinister intentions. How worried should we be about these acts of sabotage?
Klara, in a word, very. What we've seen across Europe recently is we've seen Russian spies and their proxies attack Ukrainian-linked targets, hack into water utilities, even attempting to strike an American airbase in Germany, and setting fire to warehouses across the continent. Now we're looking at how vulnerable our underwater communications are, and the problem is they are vulnerable. We've got something like 1.4 million kilometres of cables crisscrossing the world. They carry 95% of all digital communications. On a daily basis, they transfer something like $10 trillion worth of transactions. We have an example earlier on this year in the Red Sea where the Houthis attacked a vessel that burst into flames. It was abandoned, it sank, dragged its anchor, and that disrupted internet connections in East Africa for 3 months. It's a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Remember the novel by Jerome K. Jerome, Three Men on a Boat and the cable cutting drone? Just kidding. I'm really concerned about other things those ships can do because they very often have small submarines that can install devices to eavesdrop on the cables or even inject false information into the data stream. How can we, realistically speaking, protect these infrastructures?
The very nature of them means they're vulnerable and difficult to protect. Now, I'm going to say to start with that it's not Russia that pioneered this. The UK did this, cutting Germany's communications in the First World War. America's been doing it since the 70s, conducting operations on Soviet military cables using specially equipped submarines. And Britain's Signals Intelligence Unit, the GCHQ, I think something like 12 years ago, was found to be tapping into some 200 cables. But Russia has invested heavily in its naval capabilities for underwater sabotage, primarily through its secretive deep-sea intelligence unit, the GUGI. A report was produced earlier this year that suggested that since 2021, there have been 8 unattributed yet suspicious cable-cutting incidents in the Euro-Atlantic region. And that came along with other reports that suggested there have been 70 publicly recorded sightings of Russian vessels behaving abnormally near critical maritime infrastructure. Western governments are scrambling to erect better defences, but their priority is to understand what's going on underneath the waves on the bottom of the ocean. NATO states are already increasing air and sea patrols near critical infrastructure, including cables. And the European Union is contemplating a network of underwater stations on the seabed that would allow drones to charge batteries, transmit data, and examine whether the cables have been interfered with or if there are any suspicious circumstances. Mm-hmm.
It's not just the spying and the sabotaging vessels that have been worrying everyone recently. There's been a lot of talk about Russia's rickety shadow fleet of gas and oil tankers, that they are ticking bombs and they are registered to bogus companies. If there's a spill, it will be an environmental disaster. Are there any means to stop those vessels?
Well, whilst we've been discussing Russia's fleet of suspected spy ships, which amounts to something like 200 civilian vessels around the North Sea, the shadow fleet is far greater. It's something like between 600 and 1,400 vessels. Now, these are ageing tankers that are poorly maintained. They've got opaque ownership, inadequate insurance, and they often change their flags of registration. In effect, they're ticking environmental time bombs. They carry something like 70% of Russia's seaborne oil, and the Kyiv School of Economics warned earlier this year that they will soon be causing environmental catastrophes in European waters. Now, how do we tackle this? Well, the EU's proposed a ban on the sale of these vessels, in effect choking the supply of these second-hand aging ships. America seems to have had more success. It's been using individual sanctions, so it's naming vessels, putting them on a blacklist, and that appears to have had the ability to reduce particular vessels to a trade oil by about 90% over a 3-month period. So relatively, and it seems to be effective, but they can always buy more vehicles, change the names. But there's also a knock-on effect, really. There was an incident in Malaysia recently in which a shadow vessel lost control, rammed into a Malaysian vessel. Both ships burst into flames, and Malaysia was left picking up the pieces. Now, it could be that countries like China and India that are benefiting from these from the shadow fleet could be left holding the baby, could be left footing in a huge environmental bill if something goes wrong on their shores. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for watching. We are back next week with a special on the US election. See you then.